I'm your host, Madeline,
And I'm your co-host David.
and we
And
are
we said
back.
we said in our Patreon book club, it was like, oh, this is the end of Zoom. And then I, like a total dumbass, got the flu. So I am recording from underneath a blanket. Um and in my bedroom. So hopefully the sound quality is okay.
Yeah, we're doing Zoom, so you guys let us know what you think of the sound quality. Hopefully it's all right.
Yeah, I got like a new to me laptop. I'm not buying new computers. I don't have new computer money. Um, it's not 20 years old, so I think this is
Maybe
better.
it'll work. Maybe it'll work. Well, you guys know we've been gone for our holiday break, so we are officially back with part two of the potato famine. And you guys have been asking me a lot when part two is going to come out. So thank you for bearing with us during our winter break. You guys know we usually take a break in August and in December. So those are our two scheduled breaks. And this month, we might be working on a new format for the podcast in cahoots with Means TV, which would be exciting and give you guys an opportunity to a video podcast, but we're still working out the details on that.
You are accustomed to people seeing you. Um, I think of myself as like a disembodied voice in the ether. That's my
Oh,
real form of existence. So when you proposed that to me, I was like, oh, I'm gonna have to get like a fucking haircut. That's dumb. I don't what Madeline, how was your December?
okay. First of all, I'm going to say you should really try to undersell it so then people are pleasantly surprised when they see you visually.
Uh I am a bizarre ogre like troll, like bridge troll kind of character. I have many prominently placed and unappealing scars. I have what else is
Else
unpleasant
is
to
bad looking. Yeah. David
I,
spits when he talks just all the time, just spitting everywhere. It's
yeah,
really
but not like
repulsive.
it's like enough to where it would be like visual, like even on a video, you would be like, wow, this guy's
Hate
just
it.
like
Yeah.
it's like fire hose.
Just David's actually foaming at the mouth every time he speaks.
I don't have the kind of health insurance where I can get treatment for my chronic rabies. Uh,
That's good. That's good. So then the people will be pleasantly surprised to learn that none of that is correct. But no, a
Also,
video component would be fun. I think it would be something cool.
I will say I'm working on getting all of the questionable politically style tattoos covered up, but
When David's questionable political, everybody's going to think you have like weird neo-Nazi shit. Now you have to clarify what it is. It's the
yeah,
class logo or something.
that's questionable. I wear too much leather to ever be invited to Dial House or whatever. Um
Maybe. I'm vegan though, so I get a pass.
y-
Okay, well, if you guys don't know, Means TV is a worker-owned streaming service. So regardless of what we end up doing over there, you guys should definitely check it out. It's very cool and very, very fun. Over on our Patreon, we did, while we were on break, post an episode of Book Club, and we also posted me going on the D program, which is one of my favorite podcasts. So if
oh,
you
cool.
guys have not listened to the D program, I highly recommend checking that out as well. They have
Um
a streaming kind of thing that they do, those guys over on Means TV as well.
that sounds rad. What you all talk about?
We talked about me getting canceled for not voting for Kamala Harris. We talked about the limitations of identity politics within a framework of class politics.
Hmm.
We talked about, I can't remember. Oh my God. But it
Did
was
you
good. It was a great conversation.
the last I saw you were holding up, frankly, my copy of Olufemi Taiwo's book
Yeah, yeah,
on
yeah.
TikTok, and you
Elite
were like,
capture.
speaking of identity politics and its limitations,
Yes.
that
That's the book.
is
I read it. I read the book that you left at my house for once. It was very short, so it was easy to do.
this is I have to remember to only leave books under like 100 pages there.
It was a
Uh,
really easy read. I mean, it's a very easy read for anybody who's interested in checking it out.
yeah. Do you have a good December?
I had an okay December. Yeah, 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 yeah. I spent most of December in New York. I did a very New Yorker Christmas, Chinese food.
That sounds lovely. I was I actually had a really pleasant Christmas with my family, but I like every day was just like a constant battle to get my parents not to fight with my sister.
I think
Um,
that's what happens at Christmas. I mean, I don't have a traditional family, but that's what I've heard happens at Christmas.
Next year, I have already announced that my Christmas is going to be matzo ball soup at Cantor's.
Yeah.
And I will not be celebrating with trees or any of that bullshit. And I am not going to play Peacekeeper in my goddamn family.
I think that's fair. I think the solo Christmas is the move. As somebody who is generally familyless, my dad and I get along, but we're not very, I don't know. My dad and I get along, but we'll just do like a couple phone calls a year and just be like, "You doing well? Like, love you, checking in." So we did that on Christmas, and that was nice. And that's kind of all I need. Really,
That
that's
sounds
the human connection I'm equipped for.
that
Yeah, you
yeah.
know. What
But you're
about
back.
New Year's? How was your New Year's? I haven't seen you because you've been sick.
Oh yeah, actually I think New Year's was around the time I got my ass sick, but I went with my partner to Carpinteria
Ah,
and to a
it's
little
a
beach
town
cabin.
by the beach. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's like it's the quickly becoming not quite the working class sleepy beach town that it had been and is becoming, what happens.
Gentrification. Also, you have a partner, officially a partner. That's new.
Yeah,
Partner
that's a
drop.
I have a girlfriend.
David's
Uh
got a girlfriend. Wow.
and but we went to a little beach cabin and made a curry and went and watched fireworks on the beach at midnight.
Oh, that's so cute. So you
It,
you went to a working class neighborhood and you were a super spreader for your sickness.
technically we didn't leave the cabin except to go to the beach. So
Uh-huh. So you're a
yeah.
super spreader at the beach, definitely.
Yeah, I was looking at all of the lovely families and I was like, I'm gonna make your new year horrible.
Biological warfare. David enacted biological warfare on the beach, is what
What did
happened.
you do for New Year's?
I got into a fight with a magician.
You went to the Magic Castle?
No, I didn't. I didn't. I went to some social events and I got into a fight with a guy there and I didn't quite know what was happening, but I tend to fight with men, so I didn't think too much of it. But th this fight was unique because it was so bizarre. And then afterwards, when I was telling people, I was like, yeah, I was fighting with that guy. I don't really know what was going on. All of them went, well, he is a magician. And
It,
that did make sense to me. I was like, that does explain a lot of context I was missing. Yes. So
what was the fight about?
movies mostly. Yeah.
Like how do you fight about movies?
I mean, ask a magician. They're dying to fight with you about movies,
I
apparently.
will
I don't
never
know.
ask a magician anything.
Well, that's what I was like. Now I can never go to the Magic Castle. If you're not from LA, the Magic Castle is a time-honored tradition here. And no, no, I'm out. I'm never going to the Magic Castle again. It's now me versus magicians.
So are you blacklisted from the Magic Castle or just from the magic community in general?
Oh no, I'm blacklisting them from me. The
Oh, okay.
magicians are blacklisted from my life. They don't get access to me anymore. Not after that exchange. I'm done with the magicians.
What movie did you fight about? Also, I don't know if you can hear my voice is teenage boy style cracking because of my illness.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. We fought about a few movies. It was a very bizarre change. It's not super interesting, I guess, but that was how I spent my New Year's. So, I feel like maybe we could get into the people have waited a long time for the potato famine. They've waited
I,
literally a month
okay,
for part two
this
of the
is
potato famine.
by way of transition. I will say I've made fun of you several times over the break. And also, when people have asked me about the thing, I've been like, I don't know. Madeline said we're doing the potato famine. That doesn't seem to be what we're doing. We seem to be doing the entire history of fucking Ireland.
You need the context to understand because we all know it's not really a famine.
you froze.
No, we all know it's not really a famine, so you need the context to get it.
You need so as I think I told you, I was like in Madeline's retelling of any history event, it starts with like the apes from 2001 A Space Odyssey like banging their chest or like hammering their chest in front of like a giant obelisk, and like the music plays, and she's like, in the beginning there was an obelisk, and then
Okay,
three
well, you know
episodes.
what? And people
Okay.
tell me I don't do research, okay? I'm over researching everything.
Yeah,
I'm researching so much. I'm full of research. Also, speaking of research, I saw a very funny video on the internet before we get into this today. I am banned from Twitter for a week, so I'm in view only mode because I threatened to kill somebody for being transphobic, and apparently they got me banned from Twitter for a week. Um, Whatever.
what?
Anyway, so I can only view things, so I can't like do anything. So I'm just like watching videos on Twitter. And there was this video of all these Americans, and they were asked two questions. Okay. They'd be like, okay, do you think that we should take military action against North Korea? And everybody in the video was like, yes. I'm sure there were people who said no, but they didn't make the cut for the video, right? It was all the people who said yes. And then next they were like, okay, and can you show us where North Korea is on this map? It was,
Uh-huh.
I've never seen so many people be so blatantly wrong. Most people thought it was in basically the Arctic. Everybody was
Uh-huh.
pointing real north on the map, and that was wild. People were pointing in South America. One person pointed to Canada. I mean, it was pretty wild. And then I had this moment where I was like, these are the people who tell me I don't know what I'm talking about when I talk about Korean history. I mean, you know,
Uh-huh.
and it's like
I mean, other than right, like I have seen a few people who are like, actually, I'm a scholar in this, and I find these takes a little reductive, but
well,
basically,
yeah, they're 3-minute videos. What are you gonna
yeah,
do?
no,
That's what I tell people to read the book. The book's not a 3-minute video. Any book, one of 6 books, one of 10 books, you know?
it's a no nuance. I foresee a future for you in which you are like this addiction you have to banal conflict goes unchecked,
Hmm.
and you are fighting with security guards at like a Whole Foods um over the definition of organic, and you're waving like things you printed out from JSTOR in front of them,
Yeah. Yeah, that's basically what I do online every day. Yeah.
and you go into like right everywhere you go is like just a fight like
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
what.
definitely. Definitely. Okay, well, we're not fighting today. We're getting into the potato famine finally. We're gonna start actually with David.
Are we getting into the
Yes,
potato
we
famine?
are getting into the potato famine,
No,
David.
because we're still on fucking Oliver goddamn Cromwell.
Well, it's important.
Okay, so right, we talked about the 1641 rebellion, which was a rebellion of the Irish Catholic gentry. So go, but that's where we were. And we got to do kind of a big fat meanwhile, which needs to go here because basically Charles the First, King of England, is executed. Yada yada yada. Magna Carta, January 30th of 1649, ushering in what is known as the Commonwealth of England. The third member of parliament to sign Charles's death warrant was Oliver Cromwell, who was born in 1599 and who had been the head of the quote unquote New Model Army during the English Civil War preceding Charles's execution. On April of 53, he expelled Parliament and basically took over a practical dictatorship of England. Under parliamentary government, 3 acts were passed concerning Ireland, the first of which is called the Adventurers Act of 1642, which offered for sale Irish land forfeited after the 1641 rebellion. Again, see our last episode. The 1652 Act for the Settling of England, which listed penalties for anyone who participated in the rebellion, and the 1653 Act of Satisfaction, which set out the final blueprint for the plantation and transplantation of Ireland. And so historians kind of disagree about just how involved Cromwell himself was in the passage of these laws. One historian, Samuel Gardner, argued that by the time of the 1653 laws passage, Cromwell held a virtual dictatorship over English government and therefore was responsible for those laws, while John Cunningham, on the other hand, argues that much of the language of the laws had already been agreed upon by the time Cromwell expelled Parliament. So there's a little bit of disagreement about if this can all be laid at Cromwell's feet or if it's just like this was England overall. Cunningham argues that it was in fact Henry Ireton, Cromwell's son-in-law, who headed the campaign in Ireland, which took place from 1649 to 53. Ireton arrived in Dublin in 1649, 2 days after Cromwell, and after Cromwell departed Ireland to lead a fight in Scotland, took control of the invasion and resettlement of Ireland. He participated in the, if you are good at saying Irish words, please forgive me. Uh, he took place, he participated in the storming of Drogheda and Wexford, battles known for their savagery, and personally advocated for and invested in the settlement of Ireland by the English. In 1651, at the Siege of Limerick, he systematically stripped the country of food and water in order to starve the occupants. If it helps, he died of the plague.
That does
So,
help. I think that helps a lot because this is pretty brutal. It's like Ireland constantly getting fucked with, right? And then now they're just going full on. They're just like, we're taking over, we're coming in, we're fighting you all, we're killing you, we're starving you to death. This is our land, we're settling it. Leave us
yeah,
alone. Let us do our thing. Pretty bad.
yeah, not even leave us alone, die. Uh,
Die. Actually, yeah, that's what I meant by leave us alone. Like disappear, be gone. Yeah, yeah, die.
Yeah. So after his death, Charles Fleetwood, his successor, Cunningham makes the point that Fleetwood was both successor in the sense that he was the head of the English colonial government in Ireland, and he also married the previous guy's widow,
Oh,
Bridget,
oh my God. Whoa. Okay,
Bridget
that's saucy.
Cromwell. So it was like, I'm just gonna walk in here, marry this widow, and take over the genocide type shit, using the active settlement of Ireland to displace native Irish from their land. Cromwell began the land settlement of Ireland in 1653 with the transplanting first of 250 Presbyterian Scots to the south of Ulster. After Protestant Irish disputed their displacement from the land, Cromwell agreed to remove Protestant held land from the settlement, meaning that the mass of land to be confiscated had to come from Irish Catholic estates. Estimates of the death toll in Ireland as a result of the Cromwell conquest are around 200,000, among which 137,000 were civilians. The Cromwell campaign has been characterized as ethnic cleansing and genocide because of the large scale displacement of native Irish, specifically Irish Catholic population. The Cromwell campaign is remembered as the start of modern Irish nationalism. So that's, I don't know. Do you have anything else to say about
That's
Cromwell?
Cromwell. I mean, yeah, this was brutal. This was really, really bad. And this is, we talked about this, I believe, in our last episode, but when you see Ireland, they are like usually one of the only places in Europe that stands with colonized people in global affairs. Like Ireland has always supported the liberation of Palestine, and it's because they have this experience being colonized by Britain specifically and experiencing basically genocide. So Ireland's politics tend to be very progressive, and there's like that saying like all colonizers see themselves in Israel and like all colonized people see themselves in Palestine, and like that's why Ireland, for the context of like why they show up in support of not just Palestine but any place experiencing colonization, this is the history that really is the reason why they're like we know what it's like. It all comes from this.
I kept thinking of right there, Cedric Robinson in Black Marxism. When we read it together some years ago, I remember being like, "Whoa, it's weird that he's starting with Ireland." But then, starting with Ireland makes sense because he talks about the ways in which these sort of ideological assumptions about sort of or of like racialism becomes sort of like instantiated for the first time as a justification for the genocide and settlement of Ireland.
Right.
Um,
And that's why a lot of people talk about a lot in Marxist spaces, we talk about it as being racialized, right? Because it's a division it's created by man, by ruling classes of men to create a weaving mentality to divide people basically and justify brutality a lot of the time.
And it seems, right, it's often an ex post facto sort of ideological construction where like it comes out of the colonization.
Right.
The sort of ideological construction is preceded by the material conditions, and then the ideological construction is a way of articulating and understanding that from the colonizer's perspective.
Right. Totally. So it is just like we're different than these people. These
Yeah,
people actually are subhuman. They are totally different than us. They might as well be a different species. They're barely human. They're this other thing completely. And that's how like racialization kind of occurs.
yeah.
So
So my
this,
next section is like Karl Marx and the Irish question. So I think you're going to be talking for a hot sec.
yeah, let's get into what actually happened
Okay.
after the war with the time period we refer to as the famine. And
Mhm.
this is a huge misnomer we're going to see because, a famine, we usually think this is a naturally occurring thing. There are some man-made things maybe you could do to influence a little, but like mostly this is out of people's hands and this is nature and this is a tragedy. But we really see is that this is not a famine as we think of it. This is the systematic kind of theft of resources from Ireland as a result of being colonized by the British. So, the time period we think of as the potato famine actually kind of is a huge period of time. Some people mark it starting in 1651 and going all the way up to 1852. By 1652, we know we're looking at the kind of aftermath of the war, of the English being there. Like David said, we had 200,000 people die, over 130,000 of them were civilians. The population of Ireland was 40% below its pre war total at this time. And 32% of the loss in that came from just the years 1650 to 1652 alone. Like
Mhm.
this is destruction. This is devastation. In 1690, this military defeat of Irish Catholic forces happened in the 1690 Battle of the Boyne. That's what it was called. And this allowed Britain to impose the penal laws on Ireland. This is what they're referred to. It's a series of laws that banned Catholics from public office and from the legal profession and limited their opportunities for education and for practicing Catholicism. So there's a lot of religious persecution that's going on as well. And we get around to 1700, early 18th century, nearly a third of the island's population was immigrants at this time, descendants of 350,000 mostly Protestant settlers who had colonized Ireland over the 1600s during this whole process. Remember, England was like, come on, we're taking over Ireland. Show up. We'll give you some land. Hey, come settle Ireland. Hey, come do a plantation in Ireland. So this really is a massively effective campaign from the colonizer's standpoint, from the British standpoint because yeah, nearly a third of the people in Ireland by this point aren't aren't native Irish people, right? They're colonizers from Britain. So conditions following the war into this time period continue to be very, very brutal for the Irish people, the native Irish who are there. There's a Jonathan Swift quote actually about the Irish during this time, and he says, "The miserable dress and diet and dwelling of the people, the general desolation in most parts of the kingdom, the old seats of the nobility and gentry all in ruins, and no new ones in their stead. The families of farmers who pay great rents, living in filth and nastiness upon buttermilk and potatoes, without a shoe or stocking to their feet, or a house so convenient as an English hog-sty to receive them. These may indeed be comfortable sights to an English spectator who comes for a short time to learn the language and returns back to his own country, whither he finds all our wealth transmitted." So basically, he's saying, like, look, the Irish are living in poverty and destitution, and the British come and they see this and they're like, oh, I'll learn a little bit of Irish, and I'm just going to basically take as many resources as I can from here and bring them back to England.
One of the things that I'm assuming that's from a modest proposal. I don't see a citation on that quote, but right. So like the modest proposal is Swift's like sort of classic satire of English colonialism, in which he recommends that the Irish eat their babies to sustain themselves. He gives recipes. It's very funny. One of the things that is noticeable about that quote is the notion of absentee landlords and of rack renting, right? Which is the excessive withdrawal of rents from the native Irish population by either the Irish Pale, so either settler colonialists in Ireland, or oftentimes by absentee landlords living in England.
Right. So now all the Irish, we talked about this in our last episode. So if you guys don't remember, if you were listening in real time as well, and it's been a month since you listened, you'll remember that these landlords were coming in, they were charging exorbitant amounts of rent. They oftentimes were not there, or like David said, they were from previous kind of colonization efforts of the British. They were basically the British. And people were forced to pay huge amounts of money to live on land that had previously been theirs. And this is, yeah, we're talking about resource extraction. We're talking about money. We're talking about, actual agriculture, like actual foods. By this point, we're seeing foods that are grown on Irish land being exported and sent back to England. And the poor, the Irish who are left there, they are surviving on buttermilk and potatoes, not because that is all that can be produced in Ireland. No, like now when we look at Ireland, I'm pretty sure Ireland has some of the most like um sustainable like farming practices on the planet, if I recall correctly. Like they have a pretty diverse, like the land is fertile. The land can grow and produce food, but all of the food that's being grown on these farms, right, which are often owned by the British, is being exported back to England. So when we talk about the famine, this is important context to have to really understand how this is man-made. Like food is able to be grown, but it is not for the Irish to eat. The
It's
Irish are
also
eating potatoes and buttermilk.
yeah, and I mean, there are a couple things. Potatoes not particularly native to Ireland, right? That is a New World staple. Second of all, right, like this is the growth of early modern capitalism in the sense that Ireland, as a settler colonialist country, exists for the enrichment of the colonial metropole. And so it's cash crops for export, which means that what is grown has no relationship to sustaining the people in the place.
Right.
Right. And this happens throughout like this is tobacco farming in the southern United States, but this is also sugar plantations throughout what at the time was called the West Indies. Today we'd call it the Caribbean, right? This is the farming of indigo, stuff like that. So it is things that are not meant to sustain human life. It's just for commodities.
Right. Just for money. So Irish agricultural workers at this time are amongst the poorest of the poor, even in Ireland, where we see all the native Irish are very poor. And if you're an Irish agricultural worker, you're even worse off than the average Irish person. 70%, oh, 75% actually, of the dwellings that Irish agricultural workers were living in were literally just huts made out of mud, usually with just one room, and a whole family would share it. And then there'd be like a pig outside, and there would be like pig manure all around the house that was supposed to fertilize the potato crop, right? And the potatoes are what they were eating. And when the pig would get fully grown, it would be used towards payment of the rent to the landlord. And then another piglet would be raised to just repeat the process. So these landowners, yeah, were mostly absentee, like David was talking about. They lived in England, and the Anglo-Irish landlords took all the best farmland they could find in Ireland, and they were like, we're going to use this, yes, for resources, for things that make us money. We're going to raise cattle. We're going to raise sheep. We're going to raise pigs. We're going to grow grain, barley, and oats, and it's all going to be exported back to England at this great profit. And they really felt entitled to do this, right? They were exploiting obviously the Irish, but they did feel entitled to do it because they had that master race theory, like we touched on. Like racialization happens as a justification for you othering the victims of colonization. It's okay that we're doing this because they're not quite human. They're not like us. So they really had this master race theory going on amongst the British at the time to kind of make you feel like it wasn't a big deal that the Irish were going through this. So the historian Macaulay wrote, the English had become the greatest and most highly civilized people the world ever saw, all while they were doing this. And other eminent historians like Lord Acton and Charles Kingsley expressed these same kind of ideas about master race nationalistic sentiments. Like the English are so civilized, the English are so great, and then also look at how disgusting the Irish are living in these mud huts. Like this proves and reinforces the idea that the English, by contrast, are the master race. They are so civilized. So it's kind of this self-fulfilling prophecy as well. And all of like the news at the time, popular news journals were claiming that The Irish weren't living in squalor and rags because we were doing anything to them. That's just how they are. They're lazy. They don't do much. They're kind of gross. They have no culture or standards. So it's this really way to like deflect the impact of their actions and be like, look, these people are subpar compared to us, so we're allowed to do this. And in fact, without us, they would probably just be like lazy and doing no work at all, because they're such losers. And like as David said, this is an ideology we see replicated now, maybe less overtly and more subtly, whenever we talk about kind of areas that we want to extract resources from to benefit the United States, for example, if we're here in the United States, or whatever kind of, yeah, the imperial core is, the center that is receiving all the goods from this extraction. And the way
Mhm.
we see like colonization and empire work today, we have these neo-colonial models as well. The United States might not go around taking formal colonies anymore, but that doesn't mean we're not engaging in the same type of activity from a neo-colonial perspective, where instead of us showing up with an army and killing everybody and taking over, we show up with our neoliberal privatized economic policies. We use the IMF and the World Bank, which we do have episodes about. If you guys are unfamiliar, go check those out, to apply economic pressure to these regions and force them to kind of open up their doors to do business with us. And this is these patterns of us, basically entering into these weird economic deals with other countries and forcing them to use their most productive land to grow crops that only benefit us, for example, even as they starve. This is still happening today all around the world.
Generally speaking, I feel like whenever I hear from like this is not the like Rodney how Europe underdeveloped Africa style thing, but whenever I hear sort of like economists or macroeconomists talk about the underdeveloped world, I tend to hear like the coin purse of the IMF and the World Bank being like, we're going to get the fuck in there and we are going to make whatever the fuck is going on there. And like the sort of like systematic immiseration that colonialism wrought prior to the post-colonial world, profitable for us it now stands today. So Europe, America, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Though also other places in the world are engaging in the same kinds of, weird, bizarre things.
Totally, yeah. So that's the thing too. You have to think about these places that we typically think of as poor. They're just often heavily, heavily exploited by us, by wealthier nations. And we're doing the same thing that the British were doing
And
back then when we talk about them.
they're dealing with, right, the sort of fallout of their colonial histories. And one of the examples that I often give is uh, when Haiti waged its war of independence and finally gained independence. Um, they had to pay France back for their own liberation, which they did not finish doing until I believe either 1946 or 1948, which meant that they had a century and a half practically of having to pay to not be slaves.
Right.
Right. And so the legacy of the colonial world is often conditioned, even in liberation, by relationships of debt.
Yes. Yeah. And that's kind of the neo-colonial model now. That's what we talk
Yeah.
about. It's these financial relationships that still are doing the same thing, but the violence is enacted monetarily.
Yeah.
So these English landlords, right, they hired agents in Ireland to kind of oversee their properties and run their estates. And the goal of these agents was just to maximize profits. So the land would be rented out to the rural poor Irish. And then, from there, the land that they were living on, the rural poor Irish, it really could only grow potatoes because the English had taken all the productive land for themselves. So often this agent would be leasing out huge tracts of land to a farmer, and then the farmer would pay the rent for the land. And then the farmer would go and sublet the land out, like sublease it out in smaller plots to be worked by smaller farmers and like smaller laborers. So this is kind of the system. You had like landlords of landlords of landlords. So if you had 1 acre of crop that was all potato, it could feed 3 times as many people as an acre of grain. So the land could then be rented out to 3 times as many people if they were just growing potatoes on it. It's not like the people there were like, well, I'll like grow potatoes on it. I'll make the most use of my land, and then I have more free space for other things. No, literally, it was the landlords being like, if we say this is potato growing land, we can make these plots even smaller and we can cram more people in there and we can extract more profit. So
While using presumably the most fertile land for cash crops.
exactly. And you're using the more fertile land for you. So, this kind of land that wasn't super productive could grow grain, could grow potatoes, but it could grow 3 times as many potatoes and grain. So if you rented it out and you were like, you can grow potatoes here, you got 3 times as many potential customers. Think of it like the equivalent of having a giant apartment building in a very expensive city. You could have a bunch of nice 2-bedroom apartments that you charge $2,200 a month for, or you could have 3 times as many studio apartments that you charge $1,800 a month for, and you're making more money.
Oh wait, I have a very funny example of this from my time in Olympia, which is there was a punk house where like the tenant who'd been there the longest was this guy, his name was Kenny, but whatever. And I remember talking to one of the people who lived in that house, and he was like, "Yeah, we're putting up drywall to have more bedrooms." And I was like, "Sick, so your rent's going to go down?" And then he was like, "Oh, I never thought of that." And then, like, over the course of my time in Olympia, they kept putting up drywall to subdivide all of the bedrooms, and nobody's rent went down. And then eventually, it turned out that Kenny had been like, just like keeping that money,
Wow.
and
Well, yeah,
it
so
was like, but
this is what
yeah.
they're doing in Ireland with the land, though, really. So the land was just getting subdivided out smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until people were living on these really tiny strips of land eventually. And then, of course, you had people who had no land at all. They were unemployed. They weren't able to rent a plot, get married, start a family, grow food. They were just basically forced to live out in the world, right? So the people who lived in these smaller plots of land, though, they were living in this like constant state of dread. The agents who were hired by the landlords were ruthless, right? They would evict tenants who failed to pay or were late. It was super like parasitic, the relationship, obviously. The English were just leeching all the resources and money from these poor Irish people. The Irish people were living in terror. If you were evicted or unemployed, right, you would have to live in literally like a bog hole, or you would be like, I live in a ditch and I like put together a thatch roof out of plants I found. Like it was really, really, really bad. And this
I
is
mean, I think
the start of capitalism. This is what we see when people in our society, for example, are forced to go live on the street and try to build makeshift shelters for themselves. And like technically you're not allowed to do that. And then they get destroyed. Like this is really the same thing going on, but in a
one thing.
very extreme way because of the colonization. Sorry, David. Yeah, you go.
Oh yeah, no, no. One thing that like it feels interesting to emphasize is how universal the sort of role of a kind of, I guess I don't know if this term is appropriate here, but creolized overseer class was in creating extractive wealth, in the sense that having a class, like an intermediary class that oversaw the extraction of rents, meant that they could be more like their only source of profit was extracting rents, right? And so you get this like kind of like it, the sort of material logic of it forces it to be the most extreme and most like extractive, most industrialized form of production. So like that sort of like having an intermediary overseer class creates a more extreme version of extractive wealth.
I
Does
mean,
that
it's
make
like having a middle manager who's standing on the
Yeah.
floor watching you at work, being like, work harder, work faster, you're fired.
And whose wealth is entirely tied to to forcing you to the very bone,
Yeah.
right?
So by this point, the majority of agricultural workers, their families, they're living on a diet consisting of potatoes because that's the land has been divided with potatoes in mind to maximize profits. They could maybe, if they could afford it, they'd get a little buttermilk. And sometimes, if you were really lucky and your land plot wasn't too small, you could own 2 or 3 hens and you could get some eggs. And this is pretty much the access to food for the Irish who are working the land. So the average man at this time in the Irish countryside was eating like up to 14 pounds of potatoes every single day. And again, not because potatoes grow there and everybody loved potatoes and it was this cultural, historical like marker of their life. No, because this is basically the only food the British were permitting them to eat and have.
I got to point out, okay, just for people, this is shot like I go buy a 10-pound bag of potatoes about twice a month. And I'm like, this is my, like, this is potatoes for 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And I'm like walking home from the store carrying that fucking bag of potatoes. I'm like, this is a big ass bag of potatoes. Uh
14
there
pounds a day. Well, that's because that's all you're eating and you're doing agricultural work. It's intense labor. You need calories to be able to do this work.
you are not having a healthy, balanced diet. Let's
No,
put it that way.
you are not. And if you had potatoes extra that you grew, or if you grew maybe other, like say you could grow some corn or whatever, then you would sell that and or give it basically to the landlords as rent for your weird mud hut you lived in that wasn't even a great place for you to live. That was just covered in pig shit outside, basically. So this was not a great situation. And there's a historian, Cecil Woodham Smith, that says all of this wretchedness and misery could, almost without exception, be traced to a single source, the system under which land had been come to be occupied and owned in Ireland, a system produced by centuries of successive conquests, rebellions, confiscations, and punitive legislation. So this is why we started so early, because it's like you really see that you're building up to like centuries of this stuff happening until we get to this point. So James Connolly was maybe the first Marxist to talk about the origins of the famine. And we're going to talk about what Connolly had to say a little bit about this. He said that this is in 1987 when he started kind of talking about this. And he said there was enough food produced in Ireland during the famine years to feed the entire population. So it's not that it was a real famine as we think of it, like I said. But where was this food going? Obviously, we know it wasn't going to the Irish. So Connolly says that Ireland's integration into the international capitalist market is to blame for where this food ended up. And Connolly says that capitalist ideology was almost more important than the market at this time. So the quote from him is, it's a common saying amongst Irish nationalists that Providence sent the potato blight, but England made the famine. And the statement is true and only needs to be amended by adding that England made the famine by rigid application of the economic principles that lie at the base of capitalist society. No man who accepts capitalist society and the laws thereof can logically find fault with the statesmen of England for their acts in that awful period. They stood for the rights of property and free competition and philosophically accepted their consequences of Ireland. So he talks about how any relief measures that could have been proposed were subordinated to the needs of these private markets almost because of this ideological fervor for capitalism. And that, the dead from the famine were sacrificed upon the altar of capitalist thought at the end of the day. So he says basically within the limits of that social system, capitalism, and its theories, their acts are unassailable and unimpeachable. Like he talks about how this is just pure capitalist theory playing out and says it is only when we reject that system and the intellectual and social fetters it imposes that we really acquire the right to denounce the English administration of Ireland during the famine as a colossal crime against the human race. So I think the way he's talking about this is so interesting because we see this in how we talk about capitalist ideas in the United States today. When people get evicted from their houses, right? We're like, well, that's just what happened. They didn't pay rent. Like, what's the landlord supposed to do? And it's like you're only allowed to have sympathy for the victims of capitalism by saying capitalism itself is not a valid system for us to exist in. And most people don't make it to that point. So what he's really talking about here is like the steadfast ideological tie to capitalism as being like a good and righteous and fair system, and whatever bad shit happens to people as a result of it is just the way the cookie crumbles and that's life, babe. That is what allows these types of acts of brutality to like continue basically unexamined, right? The only way to examine it and say, I don't think this is ethically right would be to say, I don't think capitalism is ethically right. So
No, I mean, one of the examples. Oh, go on.
keep going, you go.
One of the examples, when you talk about people being evicted from their homes, that I often, or that, comes readily to mind is the, let's call it random application of rent control laws in Los Angeles and the luxury renovation loophole that a lot of landlords use, including, I believe it's called the Mohawk building in Chinatown, which has been in a fight with the landlord for a few years now, because he's doing the thing. And you can see this happen if you live in a quote unquote, and I say quote unquote on purpose, quote unquote rent controlled building here, where the like you'll get a random ass eviction notice or whatever, or they and it will basically be we are going to redevelop it as a luxury building, which means slapping a new coat of paint on it, putting like a new fucking refrigerator in it and calling it luxury renovations. And then all of a sudden they can jack up the rent in a way that they otherwise couldn't under existing rent control laws in LA. And it's, you get this like, well, you're protected by rent control, but really the market is going to overwhelm whatever protections you might have. And even like attempts to like rent control attempts to protect you won't. And so you might be evicted no matter what.
Yeah, I mean, across the street from our house, there's an apartment building, and during lockdown, every single person in that building was illegally evicted, and they
Yeah.
flipped the building, and then they started charging. This was a couple years ago. They were charging $2,100 a month for like a one-bedroom apartment, which was really, really high at the time. Now it sounds pretty reasonable. But a lot of people don't even know that they have rights in that situation. When we bought our house, there were people living there, but they were buying their own house, basically. They bought their own house in
Mhm.
Burbank. So they had to live in the house for 3 months until we could move in. And I remember the real estate agent was like, well, there are ways to get around the laws if you want them to leave. And I was like, well, we don't need they are leaving. We actually talked to them before we bought the house. They're leaving in 3 months. Like we're just waiting for them. And they ended up buying like a much nicer house than ours in Burbank. That's fine. We're friendly now. But like she said that so casually. She was like, "Oh, we can get around all the rent control laws if you want these people gone." And I was like, they're already going. That's okay. That's why I'm
Mhm.
okay moving in here and buying this house because they're already going. But like it is it's like the unspoken thing. If you know the right people in LA, you can get around whatever rent control laws you want. And that's one of
No,
the
I
ways
don't.
to do it. The other way they do it too is by doing there's like these like rezoning, like you can rezone things in a different way. Um,
Yeah.
you can rezone things as single family homes instead of multifamily homes because in Los Angeles, single family homes are not eligible for rent control, but multifamilies are. Like they have all these tricks in the book. So yeah, I don't know. I just think it's like very, very, I liked this assessment of it a lot because it kind of speaks to that idea that you have to have the imagination to think about and construct a better world than the one we live in, to recognize the horrors of the one we live in sometimes, because it's just accepted as the way things are.
It's also, I mean, like, in previous episodes, we've talked about Milton Friedman and the Chicago Boys and like the shock treatment or whatever it's called, done to Chile. And one of the things is that I think most people, when confronted with the actual logic of capitalism, like what capitalism actually means, are like, oh, that's kind of fucked, man. Like that's someone's life. But right, like Milton Friedman, the Chicago Boys, that was like actually people who, for better or worse, understood what capitalism was and were into it. And like when you think about that, you're like, oh, they were fucking sociopaths. Like they hate people.
Yeah, no,
Um,
exactly. Yeah, it is a very sociopathic way to structure society. So in 1798, the Irish are getting pretty fed up with these conditions, obviously. And they have an uprising. They're like, something has to change. They fight back. And in 1801, the Act of Union, what a name, is passed in response to this uprising, which makes a promise that the British government is going to protect and serve the Irish people. Um, David, do you think that that was a real good faith promise the British made?
no, that's basically rent control.
Yeah, I
They're
know.
like,
They're like, well, oh, we're so sad. Oh no. Oh, we'll help. It's like the British government at the time is Democrats. Imagine that,
yeah,
basically, if you're an American. So by 1845, the conditions going on in Ireland are this. Agriculture was performing okay from the 1700s and 1800s. Obviously, the profits and the spoils from that was all going to England. It wasn't going to the Irish people. But, that was the reason why this system, which was obviously super exploitative, was continuing because the British, the English were making money off of it. In 1845, though, something changes, right? Disease begins to break out in these potato fields, and it's small doses at first. It's not that big of a deal. But by July of 1846, this same disease had hit nearly every single potato crop throughout Ireland. So it was just rotting the potatoes straight in the ground. And by this point, remember, potatoes were the primary food source for the Irish due to all the limitations that were placed on their land by the British. So again, we were forcing Irish farmers to grow crops for export, leaving only potatoes as viable options because of the structure of their land tracts in terms of their productivity and also their size. And this is all they were allowed to use for their personal use. So obviously, what happens? They're only able to grow potatoes, and there's a potato blight that occurs. And this is what Connolly was talking about when he was like, okay, the blight was nature, but the horror, the death, the starvation was man-made. And obviously, this is exactly what occurs. People start starving to death. So while people, the Irish people, are starving to death, the British aren't starving to death, right? They're still continuing to export food to England, food that's not potatoes. And they're also hit with all these other diseases that tend to pop up when we see famine occurring. There's typhus, there's cholera. Everybody's immune systems are getting significantly weakened because they don't have nutrition. They're not strong enough to fight these diseases off. So these families are sick and starving, which means they're not able to work, which means what happens? They get evicted by the agents who are in control of the land. And that means you just have basically these poor, starving, sick people living in ditches, wandering around the Irish countryside. So around this time, 1845 to 1846, the Peel-led government in England was like, okay, maybe we have to do something to help. Remember, they had made that promise to defend and protect, right, Ireland? So they're like, okay, we're gonna do some things, maybe. The Peel administration is like, all right, we're going to give you guys corn. So they get some corn, they store it in some depots around Ireland. And of course, they don't give it to people, they sell it to them, but they sell it at reduced prices. Ah, okay. So to do this, though, Peel had to repeal the corn laws to bring down the price of grain. And everybody was so unhappy with this that it actually lost him the reelection. So
If
these
I
little,
understand,
hmm,
Oh, if I understand correctly, the corn laws were protectionist mercantile style laws, essentially tariffs on corn. So it's one of those funny things where just like to go back to the Connolly thing about unrestricted capitalism, one of the fun points that you can make is where there's unrestricted capitalism and where there's restricted capitalism, because it seems like in the colonial metropolis, in the imperial core, there are specific protections to protect the English bourgeoisie,
rights. And
right?
those protections are not extended to the people in the land they colonize.
Yeah,
That's totally true. So when he's like, well, we got to get rid of these corn laws because I got to get some corn out there for the Irish because they're dying, everybody is like, fuck off, no. And then he
we
loses
would like
election.
we would like to import foreign corn in order to bring down the price of corn,
Right.
right? And like a basic supply demand kind of shit. The English bourgeoisie is like, that's not fucking happening, man. We like our high corn prices because we benefit from them,
Right. Because we profit
right?
from them. So he loses the election. And who comes in to power next is Lord Russell. And Lord Russell, we got a whole different deal going on. So as soon as Lord Russell comes to power, the English government is like, that's it. We tried enough. We tried to do the corn thing. It didn't work. It's kind of our hands are tied. That's the most we're going to do. And at this time, we're talking really about this Thomas Malthus idea of like a political economy. And Thomas Malthus had advocated for this idea specifically called political economy that claimed food population could just never keep up with population growth, which is not accurate. This is not true at all. But he was like, well, we're just never going to be able to feed everybody. That's just nature, babes. And actually, if we do charity, it's bad for the poor and it hurts them. So, really, if you think about it, the best thing you could do and the most natural thing you could do and the kindest thing you could do is just let the Irish die.
I mean, like the logic here is like if we give them charity, they'll have more kids, and then the children of the poor will outpace the food supply. Like it is eugenicists
It's eugenics.
what
It's straight
like
up eugenics. It is 100% eugenics. So, this Malthus idea is like some people are just going to have to die, and it's always going to be the weakest among us in society. So, just bye bye, there they go. And the politicians in England are like, we love this. This makes our job a lot easier. And this is really the Connolly thing, where it's like, The ideology is what is guiding the actions, right? And you have to attack the ideology to justify attacks on the actions. Because as long as the ideology stands and is not contested, any actions that fit in along with that ideology seem valid and fair. So
It's
this is
worth
the ideology they adopt, and it just makes all of their negligence, them turning away from the massive death that they were causing in Ireland, it just makes it seem like not their problem, not their fault.
it's worth emphasizing, right? Like Malthus, along with like Ricardo and Smith or whatever, what usually gets called classical economists or whatever, like what Marx's quarrel with them was, which is he thought that like their basic assumptions were partial because they could only see from within the sort of like economic system that they were trying to articulate, right? Like, so Marx would say, like, these people are sort of saying, the sort of classical economists are saying, like, we are articulating the proper way for the economy to function, but what they're really doing is describing how the economy is functioning in an unregulated way. So they have this extraordinarily partial view. And in having that partial view, they cannot acknowledge the existence of crises fundamentally shifting the ideological and material conditions in a way that will create new ideological constructions,
Right.
right?
And this is like the quote, they will sell us the rope we used to hang them. Because they
Yeah.
cannot imagine that, like, hey, the material reality, the actual reality that people are experiencing is so extreme, and people's survival instincts are there that they're not gonna let your silly little system keep going. They are gonna forcefully change it because you were not creative enough to find a way to change it on your own.
Another way of talking about this is right, like these material conditions create material and ideological ruptures, and like a good understanding of Marxist historiography tends to emphasize rupture as like the moment in which new ideological constructions can form, right? Which I think the classical economists wouldn't be able to like can't account for.
Right, right. I mean, and this is also like we see actually that like economists are people who like experience less empathy, like when they are talking about, because so much about when we think about economics, right? So much about like most economic thought is like there's a rational way that people act, and there's like an anticipated way that people will do things. And when they've like there have been studies that are really funny that I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to find the links for this time, but I've cited before where psychologists will be dealing with economists, and they will find that like economists actually are displaying less empathy in the day to day than the average person because their thought process are so preoccupied with the systems of what should happen that they literally cannot see that there will become a point when something is cruel enough that people will not operate in a way that you would anticipate, and they will do something because they're like, I literally cannot watch this person be in pain. So,
Mm.
like, that's like a very interesting thing. But it is the idea that, yeah, like classical economic theory will kind of pigeonhole you into this idea of what is rational, rational, rational to the point that you are acting irrationally because you are failing to see like humanity, like what humans go through and experience. And the rupture thing is interesting because a lot of people are like, okay, the Luigi Mangione thing, that's a
Mm.
rupture moment. You've got conservatives, liberals, you've got obviously the communists and the socialists being like, wait, our healthcare system is deeply broken. And this is a rupture moment that is exemplifying that.
Yeah, and I always just to use the keyword that we haven't when we've been talking this last couple of minutes. The classical economists are not thinking dialectically.
Yes,
Right. Okay.
exactly. Yes. So around this time, we've got, the Whigs, the WHIGS Whigs over in England. They're powerful now, and they decide that private enterprise is gonna have to provide any food that goes into helping Ireland because capitalism, yay. And they're like, we'll give you some exceptions. There'll be some grain stores that are like hardly stocked at all, like a little bit of government help. But mostly, we got to privatize this, babe. If anybody's going to save you, it's going to be the free private market. So merchants then go to the government and they're like, well, if we're going to help, will you give us some assurance that we'll profit from it? Because why are we going to help unless we make money off of it, right?
I
So
love that as like just from like the system of capital, or like if you're like following classical economy or whatever, like going to the government and being like, you need to promise that we will make a profit is like, dude, be a fucking capitalist. fucking do the fuck, take the risk.
Take the risk and do it. But it's like, it's not, all of this is just so overcomplicated and ridiculous as a way to address this issue because they cannot strip themselves from the ideology of capitalism, basically. So the government is like, okay, obviously, we're not just going to give starving people food. What? It's the same thing we see today, where they're like, we're not just going to give unhoused people houses, even though it is literally cheaper to give homeless people houses than to do all the shit we currently do. We just like won't let it happen. So this is kind of what happened with the government in England at the time. They're like, we're not going to give the starving Irish food. Don't be silly. That would make too much sense and be too easy. So instead, they loan private merchants government money that they had to repay with interest in 10 years so they could buy more stock to sell at like reduced rates to the starving Irish.
Mm.
It's ridiculous. It makes no sense. And then they're like, okay, meanwhile, remember, all the Irish are getting evicted and they're like, we have nowhere to live. And they're like, yeah, that's on you. Sorry. We're not going to build houses for you. We're not going to build hospitals. We're not going to improve infrastructure to help transport food to you. We're not doing any of that. So all of these tasks also fell on private companies who then were hiring these sick and dying workers who were no longer strong enough or able to do agricultural work to try to build roads and bridges to help these businesses secure new markets and turn a profit. It was just like so fucked up. So people obviously, if you couldn't work agriculture, they also weren't great at building roads and bridges. Like they were dying. They were not in a good place. So they were beginning from this point on to just the deaths piled up. They were happening in mass. They were brutal, horrifying, awful, awful deaths.
I,
Whole
w- I
families. No, what
okay.
were you going to say?
Oh, I will say one of the things I like looking through your notes, one of the things that is also important to mention is that huge waves of Irish immigration were sparked by this because it was like a lot of Irish people going to the Americas, principally to the United States, but also to Central and South America, being like, we literally cannot fucking live, right? We're going to America. Uh, and so that also created like a huge population loss in Ireland.
Right. That's also, yeah, totally. So the people who stay, obviously, whole families, they're sick, they're weakened, they're starving. Obviously, we talked about that. They're hungry. They're also experiencing typhus, which we talked about. They're also experiencing dysentery because they're just not eating the right foods. Remember, they're evicted from their homes. They're wandering the countryside. They're wearing rags. It's cold. They're in the cold. Ireland did have like 130 of what they called poor houses, like homeless shelters, basically. They were completely overrun by the famine. These things could not keep up with what was going on. The poor then were huddling together to survive in the cold, which does what? Spreads disease even more, right? So this issue is just compounding on itself. Meanwhile, the landlords, the food people, right? They're still taking all the cattle, the sheep, the pigs, the grain crops out of Ireland and sending it back to England to make a profit. The amount of this that they removed from Ireland during this time was enough to feed the people in Ireland 2 times over. Like literally, if they had fed everyone in Ireland, they could have just taken profit from half of the crops. And remember, this is stuff that they shouldn't even have access. This is the Irish people's land. This is what the Irish people had been living off of forever until the English showed up and started doing this to them. So they're basically stealing so many resources that they could have fed all of these dying people twice over or once and still kept half the profit, but still made money off of it. Not even an option, not even a consideration. Nobody even thinks about it. So other countries then stepped in to try to lend some aid, but England was like, what the fuck are you doing? Absolutely not. So the United States, for example, tried to send shiploads of food and like other supplies to Ireland. And then they were like, oh, if you do this, you have to pay all of this to be transferred to British ships and then unloaded in the ports of Ireland because British shipping companies have to make a profit even while this is occurring. So, like, other countries are trying to send aid even because they're like, what the fuck's going on over there? And they can't do it because England's like, well, if you're doing this, we got to make a profit off of it still. So, like, what's going on?
I really love this again, like the when does unfettered capitalism happen and when does do like protectionist policies happen? Like that, like just over and over again, where it's like, oh wait, you're willing to give free food? I'm sorry, we have laws here.
Yeah.
Uh like
Yeah, well, it's like socialism for the rich and not for the poor. You get government
yeah.
subsidies. Like, if you look at, for example, like Elon Musk's companies get so much money and like government subsidies, but we talk about people who are on like EBT food stamps as being the problem. It's like it's just such an unequal and bizarre conversation that can't even begin to make sense. So in 1847, the Poor Law in Ireland gets amended, and the amendment does not go in favor of the Irish. The nickname given to this amendment was the Eviction Made Easy Act. So it actually made it easier for landlords to evict all the people who were starving to death on their land. And that is what prompted what David was talking about, just a mass exodus from Ireland. So
So
1847, this passes, and everyone's like, the only way we're going to survive as the Irish is if we get the fuck out of Ireland.
I wanted to mention I'm on the Irish National Museum of Ireland website right now, and they're reporting that between 1845 and 1852, an estimated 2 million people, about a quarter of the population, immigrated to the United States. So that was about a quarter of the population at the time.
It's massive. So
Yeah.
thousands of Irish people starving to death, right, get crammed into these tiny boats called coffin ships, and they start heading for England, maybe for the Americas. They're terrible conditions, stifling, suffocating, cramped, overcrowded. Again, disease running rampant on the boats because everyone's next to each other and they're sick already. Over 6,000 people died on the boats alone in the year 1847. Just in one year, over 6,000 Irish people died on the boats, and their corpses would just be thrown overboard. They're just like, oh, okay. So another 12,000 died the year after that, just going to North America. And meanwhile, the ship owners who are doing all this, transporting these dying people, record
They're,
profits,
they're making big
record
bucks.
profits. They're making money. So landlords were like, what you might think like, oh, but nobody's there to work their land. Are they upset? No, they do not care at all. They are stoked actually. Because remember, it's settler colonization, right? The mass expulsion of the Irish from their land was always that settler colonial goal. So some of the poor actually had their journeys to the Americas or to England paid for by their landlords just to get them off the land. They're like, "Oh my God, you're dying. Do you want to go? I'll pay for it." So they were really trying to make this just a land of English agriculture with, no pesky Irish in the way. They wanted to raise livestock, they wanted to harvest wheat, oats, barley, meal, anything to increase their profits. And they were like, anything to get rid of the Irish who are just standing in our way at this point is fine. So in 1847 alone, more than 250,000 people died of starvation and disease just in that one year. By 1848, that figure had doubled. More than 500,000 Irish people had died in this famine. And again, famine, air quotes, it's a guy, like Connolly said, nature may have created a potato blight, but England murdered these people, basically.
Mhm.
So the leadership of England was like, not us, though. We didn't do this. God is punishing the Irish for being morally evil. Yeah, so this is what's going on here. And people in Ireland who remained tried to fight back, but they were so weakened physically because they weren't able to eat that they couldn't physically form a strong movement to defend themselves from the landowning class. By 1850, the worst effects of the potato blight were over, but by this point, 1.25 million people had died and over 1 million people had been displaced. So within Ireland, and this doesn't count the people who immigrated away. Like this is devastating. So this kind of brings us to 1867. Karl Marx is around. He's talking about the Irish question. And David, you've got some things to say about this.
Yeah, I mean, I think like a few things that, right, like Marx's development as a thinker is not static. I feel like most people know this. Earlier on in his career, he tended to favor sort of like, I don't know how else to put this, but like the expansion of industrial capitalism in the sense that he was like, look, it has to get to the point that like, right, you don't get like a revanchist conservative like return to feudal sort of or peasant based economies. So you need the expansion of an industrial working class in order to trigger the kinds of conditions globally that would create like or like that would clear the ground for socialism and stuff like that. For example, during the like Spanish American War, he was like, I actually hope the United States wins because like sort of Mexico, that was not a part of the United States, would revert to a sort of peasant economy, and that would not develop modern industrial capitalism. So that's, you know,
And he said some real racist shit about Mexican people at this time.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Not spectacular.
Not great, not great, no. But that is, I mean, this is the thing most people don't understand about Marxist theory. Is like Marxist theory is the idea that there's a natural progression of kind of eras, right? And like you can't get to socialism, which is the intermediary between capitalism and communism, until you experience capitalism.
But I mean, it's interesting because, right, he does, like, he develops, and especially around questions of like nationalism, he becomes really, really nuanced. In 1867, he offered a report to the Association of German Workers in London, in which he outlined the reasons for the outburst of quote unquote Fenianism, a secret society called the Fenian Brotherhood, who advocated for Irish independence. It was an early Irish nationalist movement. He located the uniqueness of Fenianism in that it departed from earlier forms of Irish independence movements, and that it followed not from aristocrats or the middle class or the church, but among the mass of people, quote unquote. Noting further that Fenianism was banned by the Catholic Church until they realized that to do so would basically rob them of the support of the majority of Irish people. Says Marx, quote, here is what baffles the English. They find the present regime mild compared with England's former oppression of Ireland, i.e., like Cromwell and shit. Uh, so, what this most determined and irreconcilable form of opposition now, what I want to show, and what even those Englishmen who side with the Irish do not see, is that the regime since 1846, though less barbarian in form, is no less destructive, leaving no alternative but Ireland's voluntary emancipation by England or life or death struggle. He then goes on to outline a history of Irish colonization before pointing out that the total population had gone from around 5,319,867 in 1801 to 8,222,664 in 1851, back down to 5,764,543 by 1861. Contemporary estimates, by the way, suggest that the famine killed at least 1 million people. Your estimates say 1.25 million, if I recall correctly.
Yeah. Hmm.
Uh, and more than that number immigrated. Moreover, the population of Ireland continued its decline until at least 1951.
Maybe
Uh,
100 years, 100 years of population decline.
Yeah. Moreover, Marx goes on to show that a sudden decline in the health of the population ensued, and that though wages had not increased more than 20% before the start of the famine, prices of potatoes had increased more than 200%, that
Wow.
farms had been consolidated, resulting in a decrease of 120,000 farms. So the basic point here is that the acceleration of colonization in Ireland was immiserating the people of Ireland. What's interesting is the degree to which Marx's writing on the Irish question represents a fulcrum point in his understanding of national anti-imperialist movements. As I pointed out earlier, Marx had rejected Bedouin attempts to liberate themselves from French colonial rule in North Africa, as well as the attempts by the Mexican government to resist U.S. colonial expansion into California. He tended to view such movements as necessarily conservative and revanchist because they did not have the material basis of 19th century industrial capitalism. Early in their careers, Marx and Engels urged the Irish to subordinate national liberation for the Chartist movement for universal male suffrage. However, Engels visited Ireland in 1856 and witnesses the villages and farms ruined by the famine. Moreover, Engels came to regard the impact of colonization of Ireland on the English as negative as well. In 1858, he wrote, the English proletariat is becoming more and more bourgeois, and this most bourgeois of all nations is apparently aiming at the possession of a bourgeois aristocracy and a bourgeois proletariat, as well as the bourgeoisie. For a nation which exploits the whole world, that is, of course, to a certain extent justifiable. Madeline, I'm going to ask you to pause the recording for a second.
Why are there balloons? Hold on. Sorry, David had to cough, everybody. But still showing up for the podcast. Okay, anyway, continue, David. Sorry.
Oh, also we had balloons on our Zoom call, which was fun.
I have no idea why
The
balloons just popped up. It was very, very weird.
they were celebrating my illness.
Yeah. It's very weird. I mean, okay.
Um,
The Marx thing, though, that I think is interesting is that, look, like Marxism, people talk about it as being scientific and not utopian. I think the reason why people talk about it being scientific is that, like, science changes with new information, right? And one of the things we see is that some of the most successful Marxist revolutions have been not the proletariat, have been the peasantry, have been these conditions that were not what Marx imagined as being these hyper industrialized conditions. So, I think there is some fallacy in Marx's early assessments about how important the need to do advanced industrial capitalism really were to create the conditions that would
mhm.
lead to revolution or, like a step towards socialism and then ultimately communism. So we see that, like within Marxist theory, there is a lot of flexibility because we're constantly adding new information as we come across it. And that's how you end up with like, okay, we got Marx, and then you got Marxist Leninism, and then you got Marxist Leninism, Maoism. It's like we keep adding new ideas as people stumble across them and find them.
Or if you, I mean, like, again, I think I mentioned this on the book club. I've become exceedingly fascinated with the Caribbean as this really fascinating aporia, this like blank spot within historiography. And there's a fascinating book by like one of the first presidents of Trinidad and Tobago, Eric Williams, called Capitalism and Slavery. And one of the things that he is at extraordinarily great pains to show is that slavery is intrinsic to the initial development of capitalism. And there's a very funny, some like Marxist like shithead went and visited CLR James in his old age and was trying to like quiz him about various things happening within English Marxism in the 70s. And James like is like, you know what, you should actually be writing about boats, because the development of larger boats was the thing that enabled the expropriation of slaves from Africa. And
Very interesting,
which like
actually.
I the CLR James, he's being facetious, he's being a
Yeah, yeah,
shithead
yeah.
because he's like
Obviously, yeah. It
tired of
is
this
funny
guy,
though. Yeah.
but he's like uh, totally wrong. Um,
I mean,
but
Cedric Robinson also, when we read Black Marxism, talked about how Marx miscategorized, right, slavery. Right. He said it was part of
yeah, I mean,
primitive accumulation. And Cedric Robinson's like, well, it's not primitive accumulation, it's
that's only if you buy the racialist line that the slave is a commodity,
right.
um,
Right.
which
So
is
Cedric Robinson is like, we're restructuring it as labor, not a commodity. Yeah. Because
and one of the
you're accumulating people as a commodity. That's not.
and one of the things that Robinson and James and like most sort of historians of slavery and of the Middle Passage are at great pains to recognize, but I don't know that it's like often recognized sort of popularly, is the intense diversities of peoples who were enslaved, that they came from different cultures, whether Senegalese or Congolese, right? That some were Muslim, that some were practicing indigenous religions to the Congo or to Senegal, and that those ideological constructions which they brought with them to the New World had a tremendous amount. New World, I don't like that term,
No, I know
whatever,
what you mean. That's like how it was referred to at the time. Yeah.
brought with them to the settler colonialist projects of the Americas and South Asia. Um, right, like became sources of liberatory ideology in a way that Marx has a really hard time accounting for, or any Marxist construction has a really hard time accounting for.
Yeah.
Um,
But that's
right.
another example of how Marxist theory develops. It's like a lot of people think that like Marxist theory is like violently anti-religion because Marx was disparaging of religion. However, like the thing about Marxism, as opposed to like what's wrong with the Chicago boys kind of obsession with this very narrow idea of capitalism, is that like Marxist theory does evolve. It does open up doors to new experiences and new iterations of things. And like we see there, it's like the religious practices of some oppressed people actually contributes to their rebellion, to the conditions that bring about the revolution in many places.
Yeah. I mean,
So
an interesting sort of like a fun thing that I've been thinking about a lot is the development of the Creole language in like the French Antilles, in the sense that it was entire like it was developed out of like a diverse group of people of different African languages having to communicate with one another and create a common language with French, but with like this like synthesized African syntax, which is that I don't know.
very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, this is me just like talking about something I've been thinking about a lot lately
David
that has
Chomsky, linguist.
nothing. No, it's absolutely fucking not a big fan of the chomps.
I know.
Uh, uh,
Well,
so the point here for Marx, to get back to the thing about the English proletariat becoming more and more bourgeois, is that the profits which were obtained, or which obtained to the imperial core, robbed the English proletariat of their class consciousness and made social revolutions less possible. Right. So essentially, in like a basic capitalist terms, the English proletariat were benefiting from the conditions of settler colonialism in Ireland and elsewhere. Um, and that is something that is extra like so you get this kind of like staid unclass consciousness or unclass conscious English proletariat who identifies more with their native bourgeoisie than they do with the international working class or underclass.
which I think we can relate to here in the United States. You know,
Yeah.
we see that happening a lot with people who don't have a strong sense of class politics in the United States and identify more with the ruling class here because they are also getting some creature comforts from the exploitation of the global South, save China, you know? So
Yeah.
like we see that being something that we deal with a lot today, and I think that that is also relevant to the intersection of class politics and identity politics, you know?
Mhm.
Like I think lately there's been a lot of conversations about like identity reductionism, but also class reductionism. And I think there is something to be said for how effective the racialization and how it's been utilized by the oppressive and owning class has been at making people, you know, making people less class conscious to the point where if you destroy the class distinctions, you're not necessarily going to lose things like racism automatically, which is a thing that Marx had hypothesized. That I think now people are like, well, you need to like apply a little Fanon in there. You know, you need to evolve this idea a little bit. So I think that's
Yeah,
another
I mean,
example of the flexibility and growth of Marxism as we encounter like new experiences. And Marx himself encountered new experiences. And like you said, David kind of evolved his way of thinking of things as he moved through life.
and I think right, when I was an undergrad, one of my classmates, this guy Sam, who I really love, was like, "No, the thing is not like you're not supposed to read Marx like a god to continue to develop. It's not a static proposition." And I think that's like is just worthwhile continuing to think like, oh, that doesn't mean the project is finished. That doesn't mean that you have to stop doing analysis. When it comes to identity politics, I was amused to watch. I don't know what Beyonce did recently. She performed.
And then she
She
had
did.
like, it was a very Americana thing. There was like an American flag. She's dressed as a cowboy, like on a horse.
And right, people were talking about like the Black history of cowboys and yada yada yada, and a lot of people were seemed to be like, "Yeah, that's a motherfucking billionaire, you shitheads." Right? She's not on your fucking side.
Right. She's not.
Um, and right, I've thought about that for a long time. I've been like, I'm a very talented, lovely singer who makes music that I have at various points enjoyed dancing to. I don't particularly understand well, I guess I understand, but I find sometimes facile the intensity of emotional cathexis people have towards someone who they do not know and who possesses very different material interests than them.
Right. But that's
That
celebrity culture. That's how it goes. That's, I mean, I deal with that even to a
yeah.
much smaller extent on the internet. It is alarming, you know. I think celebrity
Yeah.
culture is it is maybe the greatest inhibition in class consciousness in the United States. Stan culture, celebrity culture.
Yeah. I mean, so right, Marx developed his thinking, and I find the ways in which Marx develops between, I want to say, about the 1840s and his mature thought as he's writing Capital really fascinating. By 1867, he was writing to Engels saying, previously, I thought that Ireland's separation from England impossible. Now I think it inevitable. At this point, Marx and Engels' conversion is complete, leading them to seek an amnesty resolution for Irish political prisoners over the heads of more conservative English trade unionists. As Marx wrote, it is in the direct and absolute interest of the English working class to get rid of their present connection with Ireland. For a long time, I believed that it would be possible to overthrow the Irish regime by the English working class ascendancy. Deeper study has now convinced me of the opposite. The English working class will never accomplish anything before it has got rid of Ireland. The lever must be applied in Ireland. And so basically, what he's saying is like, so long as there's this material dependency on settler colonialism abroad and on colonial and like extractive capitalism abroad, the English working class will never accomplish anything because they will constantly be relying in a very like addict style way upon like a little drip of resources from colonial profits.
Yeah,
Uh,
totally.
so the basic point, and this is sort of the last thing I'll say about this, is that colonial adventurism and profiteering shackles the working class to the imperial core of capitalism. No social revolution can happen before the dissolution of colonialism. And I think, right, you know, in the Communist Manifesto, Marx says the thing about like every country must handle their own bourgeoisie, right? And so he wants to have it becomes sort of the hallmark of the cap or the communism in one country idea. And I think Marx himself tends to distance himself from that, or at least have like a more nuanced perspective, which is something like decolonial movements and liberationist movements are like they are internationalist in scope, are necessarily a part of the dismantling of capitalism.
Yes, because our nations are not islands. They interact with each other, and the effects of those interactions, are far-reaching and long-lasting.
All right. So, Madeline, I
Okay.
think it's
So what happens after all this? What is the aftermath? Obviously we know that Ireland is not owned by England today. We know that. So what ended up occurring? So the main thing that happens after this that's worth noting happens in 1916. Because remember Marx, when you were talking about Marx was like, oh, they seem kind of like they're content now with the British because it's not as horrific as it had been. But by 1916, we see that this is not the case, and we encounter something.
oh,
Hmm.
sorry. The Marx quote is the opposite, where he's
Oh,
like,
is it?
I like people keep asking me since things are like relatively better than they were in the olden times, why the Irish are so fucking angry.
Oh,
And
okay.
I'm
So the Irish were mad. So okay, I misunderstood the
saying,
quote. Yeah, yeah. Okay, so the Irish stay mad. Thank God. Phew. Okay.
um,
So 1916, Easter Rising happens. The year was an Irish Republican insurrection against the British government, and this happened in Ireland on Easter Monday, April 24th, 1916, in Dublin specifically. And over 3,000 people were arrested. 15 Irish revolutionary leaders were executed, and at least one linguist ended up sentenced to life imprisonment. So, David, your future as a linguist,
I have no future as a linguist.
dangerous.
I just find I've just been reading Dumont or what's his name? Yeah, Laurent Dubois and some Carolyn Frick and I don't know. I've been reading some shit.
Okay, well, I'm going to tell you, it's dangerous. So, this insurrection was planned by Patrick Pearse, Tom Clark, and several other leaders of the Irish Republican Brotherhood. And this is a revolutionary society in Ireland within the nationalist organization called the Irish Volunteers. And this is one thing David and I don't agree on. This is what we're getting into is I often think that nationalism has been an effective tool at anti-colonial struggle. I don't think it's the end game, but you see how it can be a motivating factor for colonized people to overthrow their oppressors. So this to me is an example of that. So we've got this nationalist organization called the Irish Volunteers. They've got around 16,000 members. They're armed with German weapons that they smuggled into the country just 2 years prior in 1914. And these organizations that we're talking about here, who were involved in this insurrection, the Irish Republican Brotherhood and the Irish Volunteers, they were
Wait, Madeline,
supplemented.
can you
Hmm.
pause and query briefly why it is Germany might want to send Ireland weapons in 19 fucking 14?
What was going on during the time? What are we like? When's World War One's going on?
That's World War One. Like
That
Germany's
World
like,
War One.
hey motherfuckers, why don't you have a goddamn uprising in Ireland during World War One? And I
Right.
will say, World War One is the war of the capitalists, right? Like this is Sacco and Vanzetti times. This is
Yeah.
you ain't like if you are a communist, you ain't fucking fighting because that's a war of rich assholes.
Right.
So like it is funny that Germany's like, hey Ireland, you want to cause some trouble?
I mean, this is the same thing. Didn't Germany send a Lenin into Russia on a secret train to start a revolution there?
Yeah, and I
They
will
were the
say
ones who did that as well. Yeah.
there is a complicated and uncomfortable history of like World War II era type let's put it this way. Ireland didn't have a great relationship with England, and England's it was a friend of my or
An enemy of my enemy is my friend.
yeah, and that sometimes puts you on the wrong fucking side of history. World War II is a fun example of that.
Yes,
Um,
that
but
makes
in any case,
sense.
so
Okay,
they've got some
so
guns.
this is kind of Germany's playbook at the time. They're looking for anybody who's going to cause revolution to happen in one of their kind of enemies. You know, they were responsible for sending Lenin in on the train after he'd been
I will
exiled
say
from
this is
Russia.
also the like American post World War II playbook.
Definitely. I think we learned it from Germany. Yeah, definitely. So these two organizations, they get their guns from Germany, and then they're supplemented by the Irish Citizen Army, which is an association of Dublin workers that was formed after they had this general strike in 1913 and it failed. And this political party, the Sinn Féin Party, was like, we're going to make the Irish Citizen Army. There are also some other figures that are important when we talk about the Easter Rising. We've got Ewan MacNeill and Douglas Hyde. And Ewan MacNeill, linguist. He was a linguistic scholar turned political revolutionary. So he had been a professor of early and medieval history, and one of the kind of people that was at the helm of like this Irish language revival movement. Because obviously in colonization, a lot of attempts are usually made to strip the native people of their culture, of their experience, and assimilate them into the dominant culture of the colonizer, right? We saw this when we talk about Korea over on our Patreon book club. The Japanese did this in Korea. They were like, you don't speak Korean, you speak Japanese, you're Japanese now. The English did this in Ireland. They were like, you don't speak your native Irish Gaelic languages, like you're English now, you speak
But
English.
it's never complete. It's always like you're British, not English.
Oh
You
yeah,
are.
you're British. You're not exactly one of us because the racialization, but like you're definitely not you. We
We're
don't
gonna put an asterisk next to whatever the fuck we call you,
yeah.
and you get to be a walking asterisk for your whole life.
That's true.
Congratulations.
Yeah, because you don't get the same rights as the people in the empire. You, like, yeah, no, that's totally a good point. So Ewan MacNeill is like, I like language. I'm a professor. Let's revive our native languages here in Ireland. Well, obviously, this is incredibly political in an era of colonization. So he ends up being the co-founder of something called the Gaelic League. And their goal is to preserve Irish language and culture in the middle of English colonization. So the Gaelic League was just at first, they were really dedicated to the preservation of Irish as the national language of Ireland, the extension of it being used in like spoken language, and also the study of Irish literature. Just like, let's get this going again. Like, let's cultivate modern literature in Irish. And Ewan MacNeill published an article called The North Began in the newspaper of the Gaelic League, which called for the formation of the Irish Volunteer Force. So they get approached by Irish separatists associated with the Irish Republican Brotherhood, and they're asked to take the lead in forming this Irish volunteer group. And it was launched in Dublin on November 25th in 1913. And Ewan MacNeill, the linguist, was commander in chief. So the other guy involved in this is Douglas Hyde, who was the Gaelic League co-founder. He actually was the more charismatic out of the two, so he ended up being more well known. And he would actually eventually become the first president of the Republic. So McNeil, after being released from prison and then later rearrested, he's got all his scholarly research confiscated. He would later become the first minister of education. So the Gaelic or Irish language is really important in this whole Easter uprising because it was one of Europe's first pre-Christian literary languages. It's thousands of years older than English. And now it's only spoken regularly by about 2% of the Irish population. So
I
classical,
mean, I will.
hmm,
Oh, I will say that like the discovery, right? This is like Hobsbawm and Benedict Anderson and a lot of people like that. The sort of discovery and sometimes like I believe it's called retconning of like origin myths around language is like always an important part of nationalist projects where it's like there's a lot of like we discovered a whole trove of folk tales that just magically appeared and right I like Ireland had like a pretty good history but there's all also a like
a
we're
little
gonna
bit of
make it
mythology.
yeah it's a little bit of that
Hmm.
and I think that's like right it makes sense because you have to come up with like a common origin story for yourself right that is like we're all this one people when it's like were you though
Right. I mean, I think that's
I
true. That's just like how human beings like we tell stories to make sense of things, and like the stories we tell are usually true enough to get to the
would you say, Madeline, that
hmm.
we tell stories in order to live?
What is that a reference to?
It's fucking Joan Didion.
Oh my God. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe, sure, I'll give it to Joan. Um, so funny.
Republican to the hilt and not in the Irish sense.
Wow.
Yeah.
So whatever the case with the mythology and the reality of Irish, it is a very, a very old language. It is.
Yeah.
It does have a rich history. And by the 17th century, it obviously had started to get used less and less because, first of all, the original speakers, a lot of them were killed or forced to leave the country during colonization, during ethnic cleansing that occurred in Ireland. And also, destruction of the language was always an official part of British policy there. Like they
Mhm.
had laws like saying the Irish have to take on English surnames or they'd lose all their property. Very similar also to what the Japanese did to the Korean population under colonization. So the language of these colonizers, English, took over as the majority language in Ireland as the English took over. And the only spoken Irish that remained would have been the dialects amongst the rural poor. So the quality of life for these people, the rural poor, obviously in Ireland, declined in the 19th century during the famine. And Irish became stigmatized as the language of like the outcast, the dispossessed, the unhoused, the unsheltered, the poor, the homeless, wandering the streets in rags. And Irish leaders were even known to say, even in Ireland, the respectable people do not speak it, only the wilder sort. And those were Irish leaders. So preserving
Mhm.
the Irish language was a fight against cultural erasure and the assimilation of the Irish into the English. It was also a little bit of class warfare. It was like, no, there's something valid and good here. And it's, impressive that the poor were able to keep it kind of alive. So the British learned that they had planned an uprising. These, the linguist and the army and all these people together on April 21st. And they arrested Irish nationalist Sir Roger Casement in the County Kerry for running arms for the rebels, giving them the guns. Ewan MacNeill, meanwhile, was the leader of the Irish volunteers at the time, canceled mobilization orders for the insurgents after learning about this. But Pearse and Clark went ahead. So Ewan MacNeill was like, they know what's going on. Like, this is going to be bad. But Pearse and Clark are like, no, 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 we're going to do it. So they went ahead with an army of around 1,500, like 1,500 Irish volunteers and 200 people from the Citizens Army as well. So around 17 to 1,800 people total. And on April 24th, they seized the Dublin General Post Office, as well as a few other strategic places around Dublin city centre. And Pearse read aloud this proclamation announcing the birth of the Irish Republic. So what happens, obviously, British troops show up almost immediately to put down the rebellion. And for nearly a week, fighting is just going on all throughout Dublin. British artillery bombardments compelled Pearse and his colleagues right to surrender on April 29th, and Pearse and 14 other leaders of the rebellion were court-martialed and executed by British authorities in just a few weeks after this followed. So the next kind of thing we see that's important in this movement towards the Irish finally freeing themselves from the British is the Irish Free State. David, you've got the info on that, right?
Oh yeah. So obviously there's a lot of guerrilla war with Sinn Féin and the Irish Republican Party, which you talked about. A lot of the IRA fighters agreed to a treaty with Ireland on it was kind of a Canada deal, right? Where it's like you are independent. Sorry, let me look at my notes. By April of 1920, the British government in Ireland had collapsed and 400 Royal Irish barracks were razed. The war eventually led to the Anglo Irish Treaty of 1921 and established Ireland as a quote unquote independent state under the dominion of the British. A lot of the IRA fighters agreed to the treaty only in the short term, but many regarded it as unacceptable. The treaty included a unique oath of allegiance, with one part swearing loyalty to the Free State and another to King George V. In practice, the treaty provided for a partially free government, but the British retained strategic ports as well as some say in the governing of the country. So you get a kind of like you got it's like a little bit like Ireland is a child being sent off to college, but they still have one of those like their parents still have like know where they're going kind
Right.
of thing. It becomes a kind of paternalistic freedom. And after that, I think we're supposed to go to post 1960s. Is that what you had written for me
Well,
next?
no, because something else happens after the Irish Free State,
Okay.
which is in 1931, we got the Statute of Westminster. So this is
Okay.
actually one of the most significant events in the history of the British Empire, and it recognized advances in the evolution of the self-governing dominions into like fully sovereign states. So by the early 1930s, the dominions when we were talking about that, it included Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Newfoundland, and the Irish Free State that had been established in 1922. And this actually granted the Irish Free State internationally recognized independence. So the Irish state at the time that this happened had been kind of self-governing, but like you said, David, they were still kind of under the tether of England. But it consisted of 26 counties in the south and west of the island of Ireland that had formerly been part of the United Kingdom. So the Irish Free State at this time was, broken free from the United Kingdom, kind of
Oh,
officially half, right? And
one thing that's important to mention is that the I like right Northern Ireland not in this right like that's its
right,
own
that's
thing.
yeah,
It
so it's just
continues to divide Northern and Southern Ireland, and as we learned from like the history of colonialization, that means like the majority Catholic Northern Ireland, which it was very funny. I was talking to someone who's getting really into their Irish heritage or whatever, which we joked about that when we did the first episode, is like Americans being like I'm not an American, I'm an Irish
yeah,
American or whatever. And I was talking to someone about that recently, and she kept talking about Protestant Northern Ireland and Catholic Southern Ireland. And in my head, I was like, you might want to do like one more day's reading before you like tattoo the Irish flag on your face
yeah.
because you got it backwards.
Backwards, yeah. Well, so
Uh,
the reason the statute came about, right, is there was all these imperial conferences that were taking place between 1926 and 1930, and the self-governing entities of the British Empire at this time were meeting to discuss matters of common interest in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And the Irish obviously had played this huge role in shaping formal reports at the imperial conferences. We know that they were very, very politically active, right, at this time, and they really helped a lot of the formation of ideas that led up to the statute being passed. So they'd objected to the restrictions on the legislative sovereignty of the dominions in a preparatory memorandum that was circulated at the Imperial Conference of 1926, which is interesting because they wanted to postpone this discussion until there could be a special conference on the operation of Dominion legislation in 1929. And the British government was trying to limit Irish demands for reform at this conference, and they proposed a huge number of legal mechanisms for basically continuing the supremacy of the imperial law in the land to like keep the British Empire united. And these proposals actually received a lot of support from New Zealand, but Canada, South Africa, and the Irish Free State were like, absolutely not. British Empire, your time is coming to a close. So the position
I
advocated,
really love
what was that?
Oh, I really love that. Like, I'm just gonna throw this out there. Trinidad, also a British colony at the time. India, also like there are all like, and you can like it doesn't take an exceptionally smart or observant person to be like, who's included in the all of
Yep.
this Dominion shit, and who's just like, right? Okay, in any case, it's
Yeah.
race. It's
So this
race.
is the
Race
thing.
is the thing.
This is the thing too, where it's like you can't like even from a Marxist perspective, you cannot separate identity politics from class politics because we see that they manifest differently even through Marxist thought. So again, yeah, this is the white states are getting to show up and talk about it, you know.
Mm.
So there's a reason for that. So the Irish government is like, fighting, 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 and eventually the position they advocated for gets accepted. So the kind of idea that's accepted here is that the overriding effect of imperial statutes over Dominion laws would just have to come to an end completely. Now, the Irish did play a central role, obviously, in securing all of these reforms, but they weren't the only ones doing it. So it's important to note it wasn't just them. Other people were kind of involved in this. There were other dominions at play too. And this wasn't like formal freedom, but it was like what we say goes more than what England says goes. So it wasn't perfect, but this was a major advancement. And then in 1937 is when the Irish Constitution gets made. Do you want to talk about that at all?
No, do you have anything on that? My next section is Ireland post 1960.
Oh yeah, no. So
Okay.
Ireland gets its own constitution in 1937, and in 1949, the Republic of Ireland Act is passed. That's on Friday, April 18th, 1949, and this is what actually officially ends the country's status as a British Dominion and severed all the ties with the Commonwealth. And they say in it, we're hereby declaring that the description of the state shall be the Republic of Ireland. And the UK Parliament then passed the Ireland Act of 1949 as well, which acknowledged that Ireland had ceased to be part of His Majesty's dominions and therefore a member of the Commonwealth. So the 1949 Act also clarified the status of Northern Ireland, like you were talking about, David, because like Northern Ireland had kind of been excluded from all of this. And they were like, look, we're clarifying that Northern Ireland within the United Kingdom has a statutory guarantee that it will remain part of the UK so long as its devolved parliament basically desired. And this provision was really controversial amongst Irish nationalists because they were like, this is not a united Ireland. All of Ireland is not free. So,
Mhm.
where does that kind of get us in contemporary times with what's going on in Ireland as a result of all this British colonization and, England killing millions of Irish people and doing ethnic cleansing there?
Okay, so I think we're gonna do this because I like when you were like, "Hey, David, why don't you do Ireland post 1916?" I was like, "Wait, do you mean the Troubles?"
No, no, no. The Troubles is, I mean, the Troubles has got to be its own thing. Actually, somebody
Yeah,
did request in our Spotify comments, because you can leave comments on Spotify now for podcast episodes. They did request that we do something about the Troubles. So that could be its
yeah.
own episode. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm just going to we're this is just like we're gonna flag that this existed. It's
Yes.
because I feel like it being like at what we're nearing our 2 hour mark.
We really are. Yeah.
And I feel like being like, hey, here's an abbreviated history. Essentially, what the Troubles were was a series of civil protests over the status of Ireland and Northern Ireland, specifically their division, with guerrilla bombings, often by the IRA, both in Ireland and abroad sometime. By the end, as many as 3,500 people all died, the majority being civilians. Um, right. I think at this point, I think we should begin to talk about what Ireland's sort of position has been on Palestine. That was sort of where I wanted to go next, if that's all right with you,
Yeah,
Maddie.
I think it's good because this is kind of what we touched on. It's like when we look at people who've experienced colonization and where their allegiances lie and what the unifying kind of factors associated with that experience are, I think that really does shape people's politics and their understanding of the world. And so, yeah, I think that's a good place to go.
Yeah, so right, I'm going to end with this NPR article from March of, I guess it's last year, but when I wrote it, it was this year. And so the article is titled "Why Ireland is One of the Most Pro-Palestinian Nations in the World," and I think by this point, if you've been listening, you know. So the article says since the October 7th attack on Israel, the Israeli military operation in Gaza that followed, Al Tamimi's Muslim headscarf and checkered Palestinian keffiyeh shawl. So this is a Palestinian refugee in Ireland, have prompted the Irish people to offer her hugs and high five in the streets. She says, especially when they see the keffiyeh, some of them will walk by me and say, "Free, free Palestine," a common a chant at protests. Taxis and cars beep their horn. In Ireland, that translates into some of the highest public support for Palestinians. In 1980, Ireland became the first European Union member to call for Palestinian statehood. It was also the last EU member to grant permission in 1993 for Israel to open a residential embassy. And Irish politicians have delivered some of Europe's harshest criticisms of Israel during the ongoing war in Gaza, including being a part of the ICC calls for human rights charges to be brought against Netanyahu and other members of Israel.
I also
Um,
recently saw that Ireland is now not allowing Israel to have an embassy there anymore, and they're
oh, they
changing
shut
it
down
to
the embassy? That's
I think they're turning it into like a Palestinian historical monument or something instead.
actually, I mean, that's really good. Like, it's been
I saw people talk about it online, so I haven't like
uh,
personally like gone straight to the source, but this fact check this for me if you guys are hearing it. Yeah.
no, I mean, I think right. This has been what you said earlier about like colonizers see themselves as Israel, the colonized see themselves in the Palestinians. Ireland, especially because it was, in some senses, among the first colonial states of early modernity or colonial projects of early modernity, holds this like really unique position within sort of like liberationist movements. And as we saw, a huge number of their population was expropriated globally. um I don't know, do you have anything to say about like
No, I mean, I think that's exactly what it is, you know? I think that what Ireland went through is devastating and horrifying. And I think it's really interesting here in the United States, like our like white supremacist movements will always try to use Ireland in some way to dismiss the struggles of in particular the black community when they talk about chattel slavery in the United States and the effects of the enslavement of black people who were brought over to the United States and forced to do all this labor. You'll hear a lot of white supremacists try to be like, well, but the Irish were slaves too, you know, and it's like, well, the
yeah,
Irish
they were.
yeah, they did encounter a
Hmm.
lot of these horrifying conditions as well. But I think it's really weird that like white supremacist Americans will attempt to utilize Ireland as a way to dismiss the experiences of other oppressed and colonized people when the Irish themselves are not doing that. They are like, no, 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 no. Because we experienced this, we stand with everybody who has experienced this. And that's really where we see their politics lie. And I think it's hard in the United States because very often the struggles of the Irish are co-opted to serve this very weird white supremacist narrative. And it's not. It's exactly the quote. It's like we see all colonized people. You know, if you're a colonized person, you relate to all colonized people, and that's what Ireland is doing, regardless of anybody's skin color, right? So that I think is something interesting as an American. That's like a uniquely American perspective on it because I feel like for a long time I didn't really look into what happened to Ireland because the types of people who seemed to be obsessed with the narrative were people who were so politically different than me. They were very, very politically conservative, basically white supremacist kind of Nazi types. But, you know, that's not the legacy that the Irish people would want for their struggles, certainly. That's not something they would co-sign. And we see that in their politics and how they relate today to other people experiencing colonization. They do stand with Palestine. They do stand with any place experiencing what they went through. So it is an interesting, I think, just an interesting aside as an American for the types of people who usually are obsessed with telling you all about what the Irish went through here, they are not doing it because they have good politics. They are doing it to dismiss the struggles of other people, and that is not actually what is intrinsic to the politics of Ireland today, how the Irish think about their struggles and how we should be thinking about their struggles.
I mean, I think it was funny. I have made these like glancing references to a historian whose name I've always forgotten, and someone reminded me of what it was actually recently. And he's like not as like he's gross and bad, and like his whatever, but his name is Thomas Sowell, and he's written this book about the ways in which sort of like Irish culture is this like degenerate culture that was like exported to America, and like this led to this like dissolute cultural formation, whatever. I've been thinking about that sort of like articulation and sort of essentialism in relation to Stuart Hall essay, someone who I quote a lot or like think about a lot when we talk about stuff like this, called Rethinking Race and Ethnicity, in which he draws this distinction between identifying as and identifying with. And I think granting the number of ways or like the times that you've sort of like queried at and sort of kicked at the problematization of identity politics,
Yeah.
when we've been talking about this, one of the examples um, that Hall gives, Hall being a Jamaican British scholar in England, is the ways in which, with the rise of the Black Power movement in England in the 1970s, there was the significant identification with, but not as, blackness of a lot of South Asian immigrants into England. So people from other parts of the British colonial periphery were identifying with the Black Power movement. And I think, right, the sort of like problematizing identity politics has been kind of a hot button issue for like a few years among like with people in leftist spaces. Catherine Liu has written a lot about it. Obviously, Olufemi Taiwo. It's been something that people have recognized that it has been co-opted by sort of capitalist bullshit. That doesn't mean that you get to stop attending to issues of race, of ethnicity, of cultural belonging. But I think that it does mean that you can be invited to identify with the projects of liberation of people who are not like you. That was a really rambly bullshit way of saying basically giving up on like the categories of identity politics that have become reified within the context of late capitalism does not mean giving up on liberatory projects for people who are distant from you.
Yeah. No, totally. Yeah.
Sorry, that was yeah.
No, I like it. Okay, well, that is our wrap up to the potato famine. And
Okay.
if you want to listen to what we've got going on more, you can check us out over on Patreon, patreon.com/pickmeupI'm scared. We are wrapping up our book club over there, which is Everyday Life in the North Korean Revolution with Susie Kim. If you do not have the book, you can still follow along. We are making a point to explain everything so that it is easy to follow. Even if you have not read it, you might leave feeling like you did read it. And we have some other episodes over there too. And stay tuned. I'm very excited to see what we work out with Means TV, if there's a video component coming in our future. David, do you have anything else you want to add before we wrap this up?
I will say about the Susie Kim book, I've been joking. I when I was at my parents' house and we were recording, my sister was in the next room, and she was like, "Well, I feel like I've kind of read the book because you quoted so goddamn much of it." So
Well,
if
that's
you
on
haven't,
purpose. We want you don't have to read the book to follow along with us.
we're basically an audiobook said with two people with the most annoying California accents in the fucking world. Uh, so sorry, Susie Kim. I'm sure when you discussed audiobook versions of Everyday Life, you did not expect Valley Girl, but here we are.
Here we are. Okay.
All right.
Like, oh my God, thank you for tuning in.
Hell yeah. Surf's up, bro. Okay, bye.